Hi there, and welcome to Holes with Literary Devices and Characterization. We were talking about characterization more in detail, so there is another video on that, so please see that if you have any other concerns about characterization, within Holes, that is. And there is also another video strictly about the elements of literary terms. So you can see those videos prior to seeing this one. All right, let's talk about Holes now. Let's go. Okay, we're going to talk about Holes, similes, and metaphors. They are figurative language. The bus wasn't air conditioned and the hot, heavy air was almost as stifling as the handcuffs, page 6. We know it's a simile because they're using like or as, and the simile clearly illustrates Stanley's uncomfortable situation because the author creates this claustrophobic atmosphere and strong sense that the character is being trapped against his will, which is certainly the case. He's being shipped off to a hard labor camp for a crime he didn't commit. He's being restrained by more than just handcuffs. The justice system is working against him, as is more importantly for the rest of the novel, his family curse. Stanley isn't truly free because success is impossible for him as long as the Yelnats family is still under Madame Zeroni's curse. Blah, blah, blah. And you can read on about the handcuffs. Let's go. Okay, we have another example of metaphor within Holes. He dug a hole into his memory, page 71. This is in reference to Stanley, where he had been digging yesterday and found a gold tube. He will have to hand in anything found over to the warden, so he is careful not to forget where it is so that he can return to it later on. All right, so one cannot really dig a hole into your memory. That's impossible. This is figurative language, very creative, and it's not simile because it's not using like or as. Great. Another simile, Myra's head is as empty as a flower pot on page 29. This simile manages to categorize Myra as rather superficial, meaning not a lot there. She's a very two-dimensional character. She's also thought of as kind of an idiot by Madame Zeroni. She doesn't think that Myra's going to make a good wife for Elia. She's too young and she can't work a plow. She's basically useless. So flower pot, empty, that's a good simile. And you can read on. Huge smile. Now he had such a huge smile it almost seemed to be too big for his face, like the smile of a jack-o'-lantern. Okay, page 58. If you don't know what a jack-o'-lantern is, this is classic American stuff here. We carve pumpkins or jack-o'-lanterns as they're called for the night before Halloween or the night of Halloween, pardon. And it's to ward off evil spirits. We put a candle inside them and they glow this beautiful color. And here one is for you. There you go. So it's a simile. They're using figurative language as smile of a jack-o'-lantern. Okay. So they're using like here. This simile describes the first time Stanley sees Zero's smile. This typically positive action is portrayed in a grotesque way. Stanley explains that because Zero is often angry and is usual when he does smile. For this reason, the author uses the simile to create a warped image of a wicked grimace. A grimace is also known as a smile. Okay, blah, 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 blah. You can read on about that as well. Mouth. Simile. His mouth was as dry and as parched as the lake. Page 105. Okay, why is it a simile? Yep, you guessed it. There's as in there. It's parched. I'm parched. It kind of means we use that in the south of the USA, meaning that we're really dry and we need a drink. The simile comes clearly as he's trying to convey the fear of thirst as well as the constant hardships as the campers face in the harsh conditions of Camp Green Lake. Furthermore, the simile echoes the natural imagery throughout the novel and the motif of the lake, connecting Stanley's fear to the dry, barren landscape. In this way, the land represents the plight of the campers who dig in it. Plight is not such a good thing. Let's move on. Okay, I'd like to talk about characterization right now, a little mix for you here. We talked about that before in the video, deeply, in wholes. Characterization, and these are some ways that we can find these elements here. The physical description of a character, the action and behavior of a character, the speech and the dialogue of a character, and the narration or the story that wraps around the character, if you will, okay? We can find information about these characters, and we learned that in the video before. There's a direct way and there's indirect way, and these are some kind of some ways you can detect more information about the character. Okay. So as a recommendation, group work in class or as a class activity. In groups of 3, make a list of all the characters thus far in wholes, then choose one character to discuss the aspects of that character, as in the diagram. Each team member will speak about the character in front of the class upon completion. Okay, that's easy to do. So if you're not working in a classroom and you're working at home, you can do this in your notebook just as easily. Pick apart all those aspects and then talk about it. You can record your voice or you can talk to your teacher the following day. Okay, in chapter 7, X-Ray had his own special shovel, which no one else was allowed to use. This is a quotation. So what does this tell us about X-Ray's role in the camp? And this again is talking about characterization. And this is an indirect way of how we know about a character. So what are his actions? What is he doing? What's his role? That's an interesting thing to bring up. X-Ray is a special kind of character, and you should be able to talk about that. In chapter 7, it uses a dual narrative. And dual narrative, what do you think this might be? What purpose does it serve in this chapter? Dual means what? Yeah, you guessed it, dual. 2 things. So narrative is, yeah, story. So it is literally 2 stories. Let's move on. Dual or multiple narrative. A dual narrative is a form of narrative that tells a story in 2 different perspectives, usually 2 different people. Dual narrative is also an effective technique that can be used to tell the story of people or one person at 2 different points in time. It is used to show parallels or emphasize differences in the lifestyles or points of view of different places or time periods. So that's what we're looking for. If you want to know what a multiple narrative is, read on below. Okay, so in chapter 7, they have a dual narrative, and here we have the explanation. The 2 narratives in the book help us to realize the connections between one another. The 2 characters in the book, Stanley and Elia, are the 2 stories or narratives seen in chapter 7 that keep switching over. It switches between Elia's story and then back to Stanley's and then back again. Do you see that? Great. All right, moving onwards, just picking apart some different chapters. We're moving to chapter 14. And we're going to talk about characterization here again. How does Louis Sachar make the character of the warden appear powerful? Okay, so how do we know indirectly or directly about the character, the warden? Now, the warden, very ironically, is a woman, because most authoritative figures are generally men, especially in literature. So this is pretty cool. Think about the speech, the dialogue, narration, action, behavior, and the physical description of her throughout the novel. So this is another good thing for you to put into your notebooks. Whether you're in the class or you're outside of the class, you can write this down and then check with the teacher thereafter. Okay, chapter 16. What do we, Stanley, know about X-Ray that the warden doesn't? What does Zero's interaction with Stanley suggest about him? This indirect characterization. So what do we know about this? Or what do we know about him, pardon? The interactions between characters are really fascinating, and this author does a really good job of talking about those interactions, about the boys at the camp and between the warden, authoritative figures, and how people react. So those are the things you should be kind of focusing on when you're reading too, or when you read the story again. Chapter 17. Why was Squid's comment the wrong thing to say? What do we understand of the nature of the relationships between the boys in the light of Zigzag's reaction to Stanley's injury? Okay, so when someone gets hurt, what generally happens? Is someone sympathetic to you generally, or is someone, shrug it off, you'll be all right, suck it up? We need to understand what's going on between these boys, and you need to kind of clue in on those interactions, because that's the development of the characterization that the author really wants us to look at. Okay, Hull's literary elements. Genre, the definition, a style or category of art, music, or literature. What type of genre is it? Hull's is known as an adventure, mystery, folktale, fairy tale, realism, and adolescent fiction. Adolescent means young people like yourself. Setting and context. Setting is the place or surroundings. So it's modern day, meaning it can be now. Camp Green Lake, a juvenile correction facility. Juvenile, another word for young people. Correctional, trying to get yourself correct. And a facility is a place, and it's in Texas, and they talk like this. 110 years ago, Camp Green Lake, a town in the location of modern-day Camp. Over 100 years ago, Latvia. So these are all the places that they mention within the book as the setting. Okay, narrator and point of view. Who is the narrator of Hull's? This is the interesting question, and this is the hard one for a lot of students to answer. Even I had to think about it. The novel uses an omniscient third-person narrator who spends a lot of time in Stanley's mind, but necessarily is omniscient in the sense that he can flip back and forward through time, space, and different characters' consciousness. Who can do this? Well, it's kind of, think of it like a godlike thing. Omniscient is an adjective, and the definition is knowing everything. So this third-person omniscient narrator is the narrator of Hull's. So it's kind of like a godlike person who kind of knows all this information. Who it is, it's kind of up for question. It's just this thing that overrides the book and is telling the story, if you will. Got it? Good. Okay, the third person limited omniscient narrative voice or all-present voice allows the reader to know all the protagonists in the focal lens, as in Stanley, and what he knows. So think of it as like this godlike kind of thing, and it has unlimited access. So it can see everything. What a cool thing, like super human powers. Okay, so beyond that, she writes, the reader gleans through the narrative's offering the history of the young's curse and the awareness of fate and coincidences roles in Stanley's life, the elements to which even Stanley never becomes fully aware. The reader knows more than Stanley does, thanks to the interjections or the little things that they say, that the narrator says, and our exposure to other storylines in the past of which Stanley is dimly or minimally aware of, if at all. So, all you have to know is the narrator kind of knows more than kind of what Stanley knows. That's all you have to take away from this. Tone and mood. Parts of this novel display fairly gritty realism. We learn soberly and sadly about Zero's difficult past through his conversations with Stanley on God Thumb, and we struggle along with Stanley as he experiences exhaustion, blisters, and endless thirst. The flashbacks to Green Lake are light in tone at first, so very light, as we are presented with an idyllic town, so a lovely, picturesque town like you can imagine, where a lovely couple falls in love. But this narrative quickly turns tragic with the death of Sam. Oh no, Sam! Sam, the Onion Man! The tone of the novel is, in accordance with its younger audience, frequently humorous and even hilarious. The fairy tale elements can be quite whimsical, notably with Elia Yelnats' story, which involves a one-legged old wise woman and two fat pigs. The boys are also funny in both their nicknames and the occasional light-hearted banter. Example, their discussion of whether or not the warden is watching them in the shower. Thatcher wants to show that even in the most bad, dire situations, people can and should laugh at themselves and their predicaments, their problems. So look at your own life, and can we laugh about it? I can laugh about mine. Can you? Okay, protagonist and antagonist. In modern narrative of Camp Green Lake, Stanley Yelnats is the protagonist and the warden is the antagonist. In the past narrative of Camp Green Lake, Sam and Kate are the protagonists and the Trout Walker is the antagonist. And here we have a picture. A hero is generally the protagonist or the main character. Antagonist, someone who antagonizes you, is probably the villain, your nemesis, always bothering you, and his adversary. That's how you can remember it. So if you can remember the story of Batman, who is the antagonist of Batman? Yep, you guessed it. Climax. Think of climbing a mountain. The climax is when you're at the very, very top. You can't get any higher. And it's that great, exhilarating feeling. That is climax. The climax of the story comes when Stanley and Zero find that the Yelnats family fortune and are caught by the warden. There is much at stake in the scene. The boys' lives are in danger from both the lizards and from the warden herself. And both Stanley and the warden are desperate to claim the treasure for themselves. Interesting. The standoff drags on so long that it loses its dramatic tension, which builds again quickly when Stanley's lawyer and the Attorney General arrive at Camp Green Lake. Now Stanley's freedom is at stake as well as his life, and are the jobs of all camp counselors. Yikes. Major conflict. Conflict is something known as a disagreement or an argument. Problem. Okay. The major conflict in the present-day narratives are Stanley's sentencing to labor at Camp Green Lake, as well as the unresolved family curse of the Yelnats family. There is also the question of Stanley and Zero's survival in the desert and Stanley claiming the treasure that belonged to his great-grandfather. Stanley isn't aware that he can do anything to change the family curse and breaks it accidentally. He also does not feel any control over the length of his sentence at Camp Green Lake. While these two issues weigh heavily on the mind of the reader and have a huge impact at the end of the novel, the main conflicts in the novel are those between the boys in the desert and the boys and the warden. Do you agree? Okay, foreshadowing, telling what is to come, like a fortune teller or a falja. The flashbacks to the past narratives often act as foreshadowing for the events in the present-day Camp Green Lake timeline. The central foreshadowing has to do with the curse of the Yelnats family. Again, Stanley Yelnats I, who was robbed by Kissin' Kate Barlow, said he took refuge on God's thumb, which, as soon as we learn, there is a mountain that looks like the thumb near Camp Green Lake. This foreshadows Stanley IV's own journey up the mountain. This ascent by Stanley Yelnats IV up God's thumb, with Zero in tow, we already know his last name is Zeroni, is foreshadowed by Elia Yelnats' trip up the mountain in Lithuania. The breaking of the curse is foreshadowed in the casting of the curse. When the Yelnats arrive in America, he spent a lot of time looking for Madame Zeroni's son and descendants, which foreshadows when a character called Zeroni is introduced in Stanley IV's storyline. Who is that person? You got it. We know that the curse will be broken by Stanley and Hector, standing in their great-great-grandfather and their great-great-grandmother, respectively. Understatement. It makes it seem less important than it really is, the opposite of hyperbole. Kandansky's warning, "Do not upset the warden," can be seen as an understatement. The warden is far more dangerous and vindictive than Stanley expects. So this statement, understatement, is a warning, but it's really understated. They should be something that should be more passionate. So this is an understatement, okay? Another example of understatement occurs in chapter 1 where the narrative writes, "If you don't bother rattlesnakes and scorpions, they won't bother you." Well, that's kind of funny. The bother is the understatement. We tend to think of it's a mild inconvenience or annoyance. However, if a rattlesnake or scorpion bites you, you'll experience much more than a mild annoyance. Barfbag, who was in detent before Stanley arrived, had to be hospitalized for an extended period because of this rattlesnake bite. So that's an understatement. Imagery, the visuals. Now here's my stuff, the artistry. Much of the imagery in the novel is related to the setting. The now barren, once beautiful Camp Green Lake. Satcher makes a point to contrast the environmental conditions of Camp Green Lake before and after Sam is shot. They draw a connection between the heinous murder and the deterioration of Camp Green Lake. It's a barren wasteland, devoid of water, plants, and any form of life aside from lizards and scorpions, that is. And it's a contrast of the Green Lake that was from the 1890s, that was called Heaven on Earth. So back then it was a lush valley full of plant life, and now we're talking about hard, dry earth of present-day Camp Green Lake. That's the imagery. Allusions, something that is said or written that is intended to make you think of a particular thing or a person. The mountain which Stanley and Zero climb, God's thumb, can be seen as an allusion to certain biblical events which involve mountains. For example, Moses climbing Mount Sinai to meet with God. Religious references always occur in the context of saving in this novel. The nurse who helped cure Stanley Yelnats I is described as an angel, and Stanley and Zero take refuge on God's thumb. While all of Camp Green Lake used to be a paradise in Sam's time, after Sam's death, the area became cursed, punished by God, and heaven became limited to God's thumb. Personification, another one of my favorites. The description of an object or an idea of it as a human characteristic. So we can think of, like Ratatouille. Remember that movie? All the little rats, they're personified. They can't really be chefs, but because they're mice, but that's personification. Okay, the personifying name, God's thumb, turns a stark mountain into a haven of salvation in favor of referring to a mountain as part of the human body. This draws the important connection between God's thumb and life. It is the only life-giving place in the area. Sam also personifies his own donkey, Mary Lou, by giving her a clearly human name, as opposed to Smokey or another typical animal name. I like this about Sam, and I like the name Mary Lou. He treats her with respect as if she were human, speaking to her and calling her name. The human name confuses Stanley and Zero later in the novel, as they assume the boat they discover must have been named after the woman who looked great in a bathing suit. Page 161. Okay, so that wraps up all of those lovely literary elements and devices with characterization included within the novel wholes. I hope you enjoyed. See you soon.